Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. The gavel had not yet fallen when Melissa leapt to her feet, her fingers stabbing the air, her voice ringing out that I was a thief who squandered everything. My son sat beside her, his signature already condemning me, his eyes fixed on the table as if I were a stranger. For months I had carried the weight of silence, but in that moment I held a folder that could break it. When the judge's eyes met mine and the command came to lock the doors, I knew justice was no longer waiting at the edges. It was here, and so was I. The fans in the Buncombe County courtroom stir the stale winter air. I stand where the clerk placed me, feet set, shoulders square, forcing my hands to stay dry. Light spills from tall windows, cutting long bars across the floor. When Judge Caroline Hayes says my name, Evelyn Parker, it lands heavy as if I have been reduced to a case number instead of a woman who built a life brick by brick. Melissa shoots to her feet before her attorney can touch her sleeve. She jabs a finger in my direction and shouts that I have been stealing and wasting money for years. She repeats it until the words feel like drum beats. My son sits beside her. Daniel keeps his eyes fixed on the table where a stack of papers rests. His signature in hurried blue ink runs across the guardianship petition. I know that hand. I taught him those letters when he was a boy at the kitchen table she later called outdated before she hauled it out of my house. The judge raises a hand. The noise falls. The bailiff shifts but stays still. My heart beats hard, echoing in my wrists, the same place Thomas used to press when his own pulse grew weak from chemo. Melissa finally sits pulled down by her lawyer, who begins smoothing the edges of her story. He speaks of grief clouding my mind, of bills left unpaid, of impulsive withdrawals. He says I accuse the very people who care for me. His voice is polished, designed to turn lies into something palatable. I stand silent, remembering how cruelty often cloaks itself in soft words. The judge asks me if I understand why I am here. I say yes. My voice is steady. Years of presenting audits taught me that facts do not require volume, only backbone. I look to the benches. Linda Harper from next door hugs her sweater tight. Carol Ross from my bridge club clutches her purse. Behind them sits Mr. Rodriguez, our mail carrier, his expression uncertain. It feels like a theater production. They think they know the roles. The fragile widow, the caring daughter-in-law, the son caught in loyalty. No one wrote the scene where the widow stands still, unwilling to collapse. The clerk swears in Melissa. She tells stories of inflated grocery bills and claims she once found me lost in the yard in my nightgown. I remember that night as standing under the maple tree staring at the stars the way Thomas and I used to when the medicine left him sick. She says I hid a checkbook from myself. She pauses at all the right moments, her eyes always flicking to the judge for approval. Her lawyer asks how it feels to watch me decline. She lets her voice tremble, a performance wrapped in concern. I think of the day she sealed my wedding album in a box while I was in the shower, then said it would be safer elsewhere. Heartbreak is a flexible word, and she bends it to suit her. Daniel is called next. He adjusts his tie the same way he did at prom when Thomas and I waited by the stairs, and I cried at how much he looked like his father. He says I am overwhelmed that Melissa carries more than her share. He claims he found me staring at an open pantry, not remembering what I wanted. He does not add that Melissa had rearranged it that morning, moving what I needed out of reach. He uses the word stubborn. It drops like a stone in my chest. His eyes flick toward me for a moment. Shame colors his cheeks. I want to tell him shame can be a compass if you let it. But I say nothing. Linda testifies next. She claims she saw me in slippers at the mailbox, confused. She omits that I was waiting for an envelope with a flash drive I did not want Melissa to see. Carol tells the court I abandoned our bridge club. She does not know Melissa had been answering my phone telling people I was resting. Mr. Rodriguez says there were mail holds he had never seen before. I remember the day Melissa requested them for a trip that never existed. Melissa's lawyer brings out a poster board with neat columns of withdrawals. He taps each one, laying out a pattern of decline. I see a different pattern: March Thomas's birthday, May the azaleas blooming, July the heavy heat when the porch groans, October the first frost. He has built a story from my grief and dressed it as incompetence. The judge asks again if I understand. I answer yes. My fingers tighten on the folder I have held all morning. Inside are the records Melissa hoped I had forgotten. Originals and copies, phone logs, a flash drive of late-night scans, a notarized affidavit pressing its seal deep into the page, photographs from a hidden camera showing Melissa at my desk practicing my signature while the dishwasher hummed. Melissa leans to whisper to her attorney. He tells the court that families sometimes mistake help for control. He says Daniel is torn between duties. He says Melissa suffers under the weight of false accusations. He wraps it all in the word compassion, spending it like currency. Judge Hayes straightens. She has heard these words before. Her eyes fix on me. There is no anger there, only the question. Can you stand under the weight of your own truth? I draw a breath that tastes like varnish and paper. I remember the day I overheard Daniel ask his wife if this was the only way, and Melissa reply that sometimes the right thing looks unkind. I feel the edge of the affidavit under my fingers. I think of Thomas and the nights we counted stars because sleep would not come. Daniel looks up at last. His eyes meet mine, then dart away. He flinches as if burned. I do not step toward him. I anchor myself where I stand in the certainty that ink and numbers cannot be bent into kindness. A mother can love her son and still demand the truth. I tell the judge I have materials for the court. My voice is plain, steady, the way I once reported a sum to a client. The judge nods. The bailiff approaches. My grip on the folder tightens for a fraction of a second before I let it go. The folder moves hand to hand until it rests on the bench. The whole room seems to lean with it. Melissa whispers again, her confidence fraying. Daniel presses his lips tight. Linda pulls her sweater closer. Carol studies her hands. The judge opens the folder. Her eyes travel across the first page, then the second. She lingers on Dr. Grant's letter, then stops at a photograph. The silence grows heavy. When she looks up, her face has changed. It is no longer blank. Not yet verdict, not yet fury, but sharpened attention. In that pause before she speaks, something in my chest eases, not relief, but the beginning of it. I stand straighter. The floor feels solid again. My hands hang empty at my sides, ready for what comes next. The morning I buried Thomas was colder than the weather report had promised. The ground at Green Hills Cemetery was hard, the grass brittle beneath my shoes, and the words spoken over his coffin blurred into the sound of wind cutting through bare branches. After the crowd left, I stood with my hand on the casket longer than I should have, whispering things no one else would ever hear. He had been my compass for 40 years, and suddenly I was left with a silence that echoed in every corner of the house we built together. The insurance paperwork came quickly, too quickly, arriving in neat envelopes addressed to Mrs. Evelyn Parker, survivor. The word mocked me each time I read it. I signed where I was told deposited checks that looked like they belonged to another life and set the files in the bottom drawer of the oak cabinet in the study. Thomas had worked 3 decades as a civil engineer, steady and meticulous. Between his savings and my retirement accounts, we had enough to keep me safe for the years ahead. I told myself I would not have to depend on anyone, but the empty chair at the dinner table suggested otherwise. Winter stretched into spring, and grief settled into routines. I drank my morning coffee by the kitchen window, stared at the driveway where his truck used to be, tended to the roses he planted, and tried to ignore the weight of the quiet. Friends called at first, but after the second month, the conversations grew shorter. People assumed time healed. It did not. It only reshaped the wound. When Daniel showed up in January of the next year with Melissa at his side, I wanted to believe their offer was born of love. He stood in the doorway, shoulders hunched like a boy again, and said they worried about me being alone in a big 2-story house. Melissa smiled, carrying a casserole dish, as if she were stepping straight out of a magazine ad for Family Harmony. I let them in. I let them stay. Loneliness will make a person bargain with instincts that whisper caution. The first weeks were easier than I expected. Melissa cooked dinners, filling the kitchen with the smells of chicken pot pie and apple crisp. Daniel fixed a squeaky hinge and replaced a light bulb in the stairwell. Neighbors noticed. Linda Harper stopped me in the driveway one afternoon and said how lucky I was to have such attentive children. Carol Ross from the Bridge Club patted my hand in the grocery store and said Melissa seemed like a blessing. I nodded, even as something in me resisted the picture they painted. I caught the first odd moment on a gray morning in February. I had gone upstairs to put away laundry and heard a faint rustle from the study. When I opened the door, Melissa was crouched by the file cabinet. She looked up quickly, papers in her hand. She said she was searching for the life insurance statement because she wanted to make sure I had deposited everything correctly. She laughed lightly and said she could never figure out bank paperwork. Her fingers smoothed the top page before she slid it back into the drawer. I told myself it was nothing, that she meant well. Still, I locked the drawer that evening. Her helpfulness became a kind of shadow. She followed me into the kitchen to ask if I needed the grocery list written out. She lingered when I opened bills. She suggested I let her set up automatic payments so I would not have to worry about due dates. I thanked her but declined, trying to sound casual. She tilted her head with a sympathetic smile that never reached her eyes and said she only wanted to make things easier. Daniel always nodded along, grateful to his wife for easing my burden. I wondered when my son had stopped believing I was capable. Nights were the hardest. I lay awake listening to the creaks of the house, the faint sound of footsteps down the hall. Once I heard them pause outside my door, and when I sat up, the shadow slipped away. In the morning, Melissa placed a cup of tea on the table and asked if I had slept. Her tone was gentle, her hands folded neatly, but the question landed like a probe. I told her yes and looked away. The neighbors continued to admire her. Linda told me Melissa had mentioned I was struggling with memory since Thomas passed. Carol said she understood why I no longer joined the bridge games, that Melissa had explained I was embarrassed about forgetting cards. Their pity burned worse than their distance. I tried to protest, but the words tangled in my throat. It was easier to nod and retreat into silence. One Sunday after church, I returned to find the lock on the study drawer scratched. I asked Daniel if he had needed something. He looked puzzled and said no, he never went through my papers. Melissa appeared in the doorway with a load of folded towels and said she had tried to open it to put away important mail but must have used the wrong key. Her voice was airy as though it were a trivial mistake. I said nothing. I simply walked over and slid the drawer shut again, holding the key in my fist. By early March, the house that once felt like a refuge now felt like a stage. Every move I made seemed observed, catalogued. I started writing notes to myself, reminders of conversations and dates, a defense against the doubts she seeded with her careful questions. Did I pay that bill? Had I forgotten where I placed the checkbook? Her voice echoed even when she was not in the room. The night I found her again near the cabinet, she did not look startled. Instead, she held up a folder and said she was organizing things for me, smiling with the confidence of someone who had already convinced the world of her version of events. I took the folder from her hand and closed the drawer. My pulse thudded in my ears. She watched me for a long second, her smile not faltering, and then she turned and left the room. That was the moment I knew the real battle had only just begun. It started with the dining room. Melissa stood in the doorway one afternoon, arms folded, surveying the space as if she were an interior designer hired for a consultation. She said the dark oak table felt heavy, oppressive, even that it kept me tied to the past. If I replaced it with something modern and bright, she explained the change might help me heal. Her tone carried the kind of certainty that left little room for argument. Daniel stood behind her, nodding as if she had voiced a truth he had long known, but never said. That table was the first big purchase Thomas and I made after our wedding. I remembered the feel of its polished surface under my palms as we signed mortgage papers, the scrape of chairs during family dinners, the laughter of Daniel's friends during high school birthday parties. It was the center of our life. I told Melissa as much, but she only smiled gently and said, "Sometimes objects hold us back more than they help us." A week later, I came home from church and found the dining room empty. The chairs were gone, the table vanished, a hollow space left behind. Melissa greeted me cheerfully from the kitchen and said she had donated it to a charity that furnished homes for refugees. She assured me it was the right thing to do, that my sorrow seemed to deepen every time I looked at it. I stood there, my bag still on my shoulder, unable to answer. Daniel put an arm around her waist and said it was probably for the best that it was just furniture. After that, small things began disappearing. The wedding album I kept in the living room cabinet was no longer there when I reached for it one rainy evening. Melissa said she had put it in storage for safekeeping because the damp weather could damage the photos. My protests sounded petty in my own ears, and Daniel sighed with a mix of impatience and pity. Next was the grandfather clock Thomas had inherited from his father. It had ticked in our hallway for decades, its chimes a part of the rhythm of the house. One morning, I noticed the silence, the space against the wall empty. Melissa explained that it had been taken for repair because it no longer kept time accurately. She promised it would return soon, but weeks passed with no sign of it. I began walking through the house with a kind of inventory in my head, trying to remember what should be where, what used to sit on a shelf or hang on a wall. Each time something was missing, Melissa had an explanation ready. Items were being donated, repaired, or simply moved to storage. She used words like fresh start and decluttering phrases that sounded reasonable to anyone not living inside my skin. One evening after Daniel had gone upstairs, I opened the small velvet box Thomas used to keep in his dresser. It once held his collection of pocket watches pieces he had collected over years. each one polished carefully on Sunday afternoons. The box was empty. My breath caught in my throat. I searched the drawers, the closet, every corner of the bedroom. Nothing. I carried the box downstairs and found Melissa folding laundry in the living room. I asked her directly where the watches were. She looked up unruffled and said she had donated them. Her voice was calm, almost cheerful, as if she had done me a kindness. She explained that they were just gathering dust reminders of loss, and that someone else could put them to better use. Heat rushed to my face. I could barely form words. Those watches were Thomas's pride symbols of his patience, an eye for detail pieces of him I was not ready to let go. I told her she had no right. She tilted her head and said I seemed more upset by objects than by healing, and that clinging to the past was unhealthy. Daniel came into the room, then hearing the raised voices. He looked at Melissa, then at me, and said gently that I should not get worked up over things. He called them just stuff memories I carried in my heart anyway, not in wood or metal. I wanted to shake him to demand he remember the way his father's hands held those watches, how he used to tell stories about the men who had owned them before him. Instead, I stood frozen, the empty velvet box in my hands, while Melissa folded the last shirt and placed it neatly on the pile. Later that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing on me heavier than the dark. I thought about the table, the album, the clock, the watches. Piece by piece, my life with Thomas was being stripped away, erased, under the guise of kindness. The walls of my own home were shifting, becoming less mine with every passing week. The next morning, I locked my bedroom door before leaving for errands. It was a small act, almost childish, but it gave me a sense of control. When I returned, Melissa asked casually if I had lost my key because she had tried to bring in fresh sheets and found the door locked. I told her I had wanted privacy. She smiled again, that same smile that looked generous to outsiders, but sharp to me. She said of course, but added that privacy sometimes leads to loneliness. I said nothing. I only went upstairs and checked the drawers again, my hands trembling. Everything was still there this time, but I knew it was only a matter of time before something else disappeared. I began carrying small keepsakes in my purse, pieces I could not bear to lose. A photograph of Thomas holding Daniel as a baby. The silver locket my mother gave me on my wedding day. A letter Thomas wrote me during our first year of marriage. I felt foolish carrying them everywhere, but it was the only way I could be certain they remained mine. When Melissa noticed my purse was heavier than usual, she asked if I needed help organizing it. I told her sharply no, clutching the straps tight. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a flash of calculation quickly masked by concern. She said she only wanted to ease my burden. By then, the house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a stage being dismantled piece by piece while I stood powerless in the wings. And though I wanted to believe Daniel would see what was happening, his words echoed louder than my doubts. "Mom, it's just stuff. You need to move on." But I could not. Not when every missing item felt like a small funeral, a burial of the life Thomas and I had built. And when I held that empty velvet box, I understood with chilling certainty that the real loss was not the watches or the table. It was the erosion of memory itself, the slow erasing of who I had been, one object at a time. After that fight, the air in the house shifted. Melissa grew softer in voice, but sharper in presence, slipping into every corner of my daily life, under the banner of care. She began commenting on envelopes left on the counter. She picked up the property tax bill one morning, shaking her head with a sigh, as though it weighed on her more than it did on me. She said the amount seemed high, that maybe I had been overpaying without realizing it. When the utility bill arrived, she frowned again, pointing out how excessive it looked for a house with just one person. I told her I had managed bills for decades, that Thomas and I never missed a payment. She smiled as though humoring a child and said times had changed, that online banking was complicated and easy to mismanage. She suggested it would give me peace of mind if she handled it. Daniel agreed, his voice calm, telling me Melissa was good at these things and that it would take the stress off me. One evening at the kitchen table, Melissa leaned close and said it would help us bond if she helped with my accounts. She spoke about family trust, about wanting me to rest and not worry. I wanted to say no, to hold on to what little control I had left, but loneliness pressed against my ribs like a weight. I gave her the passwords, telling myself it might build a bridge between us, telling myself I was not surrendering anything important. At first, she gave me updates, little reports about what had been paid and what needed attention. She showed me a chart she made in a notebook, each line color-coded, her handwriting neat and careful. She praised herself for finding ways to save clipping coupons and reducing unnecessary expenses. Daniel patted her shoulder, saying she was a lifesaver. I sat across from them, feeling both grateful and uneasy, watching as the ledger of my life shifted into her hands. Weeks passed. I noticed fewer envelopes arriving. Melissa explained that she had switched everything to paperless billing. She said clutter was bad for me, that I needed simplicity. I nodded, but my chest tightened with every piece of mail I no longer saw. I began asking questions, and her answers were always ready, wrapped in confidence and concern. Then came the text alert from the bank. $7,500 had been withdrawn from my savings account. The number glowed against my phone screen like a siren. My stomach turned cold. I waited until Daniel left for work and confronted Melissa in the kitchen. She did not flinch. She reached for a folder she had already prepared and slid an invoice across the counter. It was for roof repairs, she explained. She reminded me that we had talked about a leak, though I could not remember such a conversation. The invoice looked official enough printed on letterhead, but when my eyes landed on the signature line, my heart stopped. There was my name, but not in my hand. The letters slanted wrong, the pen pressure uneven. It looked like a copy of me, a mask on paper. I asked her when I had signed it. She smiled faintly, as if forgiving me for forgetting, and said I had agreed to it weeks ago after dinner. She placed a gentle hand on mine, telling me stress and grief played tricks on memory. I pulled my hand away. My pulse thundered in my ears. She only shrugged, tucking the invoice back into the folder. She said the important thing was that the house was safe, that I would not have to worry about water damage now. That night I could not sleep. I sat in the dark of my room, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, the echo of her words circling like gnats. I replayed every detail of the signature. It was mine, but not mine. I thought of the study, of the times I had caught her rifling through my papers, of the scratches on the lock. The next morning, I called the bank, pretending I was verifying routine information. I asked about the withdrawal. The clerk confirmed it had been processed in person with a signed authorization. She said everything looked normal. I thanked her and hung up with my hand shaking. Daniel came home that evening cheerful, asking about dinner. I wanted to tell him everything, to thrust the invoice into his hands and demand he see what was happening, but his trust in her radiated too strongly. He kissed her cheek, praised her for cooking, and looked at me with gentle concern, asking if I was feeling stronger these days. The words curdled in my throat. I smiled thinly and said I was fine. Later, I checked the folder in my desk where I had kept original bank statements. Several were missing. In their place sat newer versions' numbers adjusted just enough to blur the truth. My breath came short. I closed the drawer quickly, locking it, and sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the key until my knuckles whitened. Melissa knocked softly a few minutes later, asking if I needed tea. Her voice was low, soothing, the same tone she used when neighbors were around. I told her no. I waited until her footsteps faded before letting out the breath I had been holding. The house felt smaller that night, the walls pressing in. Each room whispered reminders of what had been taken, what was being controlled. I lay back against the slipping away, not with a single smile and a forged name that looked too much like mine to deny. The next week slid by like a slow fever. Melissa's voice grew softer in public but sharper when the doors were closed. She began pointing out things I supposedly forgot. She would hand me a bill and say I had already asked her to pay it yesterday. She claimed I misplaced checks that I had left the stove on, that I repeated myself at dinner. Each correction was gentle enough to sound like care, but sharp enough to cut at my confidence. At first I argued. I told her I never said those things, that she must be mistaken. She would tilt her head with sympathy, her eyes glistening with practiced sadness, and whisper that grief changes memory, that I should not be hard on myself. Daniel would listen from his chair frowning and say, maybe she was right. Maybe I was just tired. The doubt settled heavy in me, so much heavier than her words. Soon the neighbors began treating me differently. Linda Harper waved at me from her yard, but no longer lingered for conversation. When I asked her if I had done something to offend her, she smiled thinly and said Melissa had told her I was struggling with short-term memory. She patted my hand and told me not to worry, that everyone understood. Her kindness felt like pity, and pity is a cold blanket. Carol Ross stopped calling. When I saw her at the grocery store, she gave me a soft smile and said she understood why I no longer came to bridge. She told me Melissa had explained I was too tired to play, that I did not want the burden of cards and conversation. She promised to give me space. I wanted to scream that I never said such a thing, that I longed for the noise of their laughter and the comfort of the table, but the words stuck. I nodded and let her walk away. The calls from my bridge group stopped entirely. The phone sat silent on the kitchen counter, a reminder that I was alone even when I wasn't. Each day felt smaller. The house, once full of Thomas's voice and Daniel's laughter, became a stage where Melissa directed every line. She told stories about me in hushed tones, stories that took root faster than truth ever could. One afternoon, I overheard her on the porch with Linda. She told her I sometimes forgot what year it was that I left notes to myself taped to the fridge because I could not keep track of days. She spoke with such earnest concern that I almost believed it myself. Linda gasped softly, promised to check in on me, and Melissa thanked her as if she carried the heaviest burden of all. I started questioning my own mind. I wrote everything down in a notebook, each conversation, each task completed, each bill I had seen with my own eyes. I hid the notebook under the mattress the way a child might hide a diary. When Melissa asked if I remembered something, I checked the pages in secret, reassuring myself that I was not imagining the truth. Still, the isolation grew. On Sunday mornings at church, people spoke to me slowly with exaggerated patience. The pastor asked if I needed help arranging transportation, even though I still drove myself every week. I saw Melissa smile modestly when others praised her for taking such good care of me. Daniel drifted further from me, caught in her web. He would come into the living room at night, sit beside me, and gently suggest I let Melissa handle more, that it was only temporary, that she wanted what was best for me. I looked into his face so much like Thomas's and felt my chest ache. The boy who once defended me on the playground now believed I needed protection from myself. The night that broke me came in whispers. I was upstairs walking quietly to the bathroom when I heard voices in the living room below. Melissa's tone was low but clear. She told Daniel that once they got guardianship, everything would be theirs. My breath froze. Daniel asked softly if that was necessary. She said yes, that it was the only way to secure their future, that I would be better off in assisted living where professionals could watch me. I gripped the railing until my knuckles burned. The words felt like stones hurled into my chest. Guardianship. The word twisted into a cage in my mind. Melissa's laugh followed, quiet but sharp. She told Daniel it was all for the best, that he should not feel guilty, that love sometimes required difficult choices. I crept back to my room, every step careful, every breath shallow. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, staring at my trembling hands. The notebook under the mattress pressed against me like a lifeline. My world was narrowing, my voice fading under her stories, but in that moment I knew one thing with clarity. If I let her finish this plan, I would lose more than my money or my home. I would lose myself. I closed my eyes, clutching the pen from my nightstand, and promised silently that I would not let her erase me. The phone rang early on a Thursday morning while I was still in my robe, the kettle just starting to whistle. The number on the screen belonged to the bank where Thomas and I had kept our retirement accounts for decades. The voice on the other end was polite but firm, informing me that $15,000 had been withdrawn from my account the previous afternoon. She asked if I wanted to verify the transaction. My chest went cold. I told her I had not authorized anything of the sort. She hesitated, then explained that the withdrawal had been signed for and processed in person. I ended the call with shaky thanks, set the phone on the counter, and gripped the edge until my knuckles burned. Melissa breezed into the kitchen a few minutes later with her hair freshly curled, her voice bright. I asked her if she knew anything about the withdrawal. She blinked, then quickly pulled out a manila folder and laid down a photocopied invoice. She said it was for roof repairs, reminding me that we had discussed leaks that could have caused long-term damage. The paper was thin, the ink faint, the kind of copy a home printer produces when the cartridge is running low. I told her I had no memory of authorizing such work. She put on her gentle smile, the one that looked tender to Daniel and everyone else, and said I had approved it after dinner a few weeks back. She insisted she had even watched me sign the form. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was my name, but the letters leaned too far to the right, the loops uneven, the strokes too heavy. It looked like a practiced imitation, close enough to trick a clerk, but nowhere near the precision of my own hand. Melissa reached across the counter, squeezing my wrist. She whispered that grief was playing tricks on me again, that I was forgetting conversations and signing things without realizing. She told me not to worry, that she had everything under control. I pulled my arm away, the warmth of her fingers leaving behind a chill. That night, I went to the study after they had gone to bed. I opened the drawer where I had kept original bank statements and insurance documents. Several were gone. In their place sat clean copies, numbers adjusted, dates blurred. My stomach clenched as I flipped through them. Whole transactions had vanished, replaced by tidy versions of events that never happened. I searched deeper, moving folders and lifting files. At the very back, I found an envelope that had been carelessly shoved in. Inside was a withdrawal form stamped by the bank. My name was written across the bottom, but it was not my hand. The strokes were awkward, forced, the spacing wrong. It was like seeing a stranger try on my skin. I sat at the desk with the form in my lap, my breath ragged. $15,000. That was not charity furniture or pocket watches quietly disappearing. That was my future being siphoned away, one forged stroke at a time. I pressed my palms flat against the desk to steady myself. I thought of Thomas and the years he had spent planning for my safety, the hours we had both worked to ensure I would never be at the mercy of anyone. I thought of Daniel asleep down the hall, the boy I had raised to know honesty and loyalty, now blind to the woman dismantling everything around him. Footsteps creaked on the stairs. I quickly slid the form back into the envelope, tucked it under a pile of magazines, and closed the drawer. Melissa appeared in the doorway in her robe, hair loose, eyes sharp, even in the dim light. She asked if I could not sleep. I forced a smile and said I had been looking through old photos of Thomas. She nodded, stepped into the room, and placed a hand on my shoulder. She told me it was not healthy to linger in the past, that I should let her handle the paperwork from now on, so I could focus on healing. I murmured something vague and waited until she left before letting my mask slip. The silence of the house pressed heavy on me. I pulled the envelope back out, staring at the false version of myself inked across the page. For the first time, the fear was joined by something stronger, sharper, a heat rising in my chest. I folded the paper carefully and hid it inside my robe pocket. I would not let it disappear into storage or donation boxes or Melissa's tidy explanations. This piece of paper was proof. Proof that I was not confused, that I was not imagining theft, that my memory had not betrayed me. When I finally laid down the weight of the form pressed against my side, I knew sleep would not come. The house creaked as it always did, but now the sound no longer felt like age. It felt like warning. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the withdrawal form I had hidden in my robe pocket. The forged signature glared back at me like an accusation not of my weakness, but of the audacity surrounding me. My hands shook as I reached for the phone. There was only one person I trusted with something like this, someone who would not dismiss me as grieving or paranoid. Janet Morales answered on the third ring, her voice warm but cautious. She had been my colleague for 15 years before I retired. She now specialized in forensic accounting, tracing financial crimes when families or businesses suspected fraud. I told her everything, my words rushing like a flood. The missing documents, the invoices, the neighbors repeating stories Melissa had spread, and now this form with my false name sprawled across it. She was quiet for a moment, and I feared even she might think I was imagining things. Then her voice firmed. "Evelyn, you are not losing your mind. You are being set up. You need to gather evidence, and you need to do it quietly." She instructed me to photograph every transaction I could find, to keep duplicates of all correspondence, and to secure anything with original signatures. She told me about small hidden cameras that could be placed in my study legal since it was my home, so long as I only recorded what happened in my space. She reminded me to say nothing, to act as though I suspected nothing, because people like Melissa thrived on catching fear before it turned into resistance. After we hung up, I sat in the silence clutching the phone, breathing shallow. For the first time in months, I felt a thread of control weave back into my hands. That afternoon, I drove to a small electronics shop on the edge of Asheville, telling Melissa I was running errands. I paid in cash for a camera no larger than a deck of cards, one that could slip between books on a shelf or perch unnoticed on a ledge. That night after they went to bed, I set it in the study. My fingers trembled as I adjusted its angle toward the desk, where Melissa always spread out her folders. The red light blinked once and then disappeared. I whispered a prayer to Thomas that I was not too late, that my instincts would not fail me now. The next morning unfolded like all the others. Melissa poured coffee and asked if I had slept. Daniel kissed her cheek and left for work. I went through the motions, folding laundry, sweeping the kitchen floor, pretending calm. But inside, every nerve hummed. Late that afternoon, when Melissa thought I was napping, I heard the study door creak. I stayed upstairs holding my breath. The minutes dragged long until I finally dared to slip back down. Heart pounding, I retrieved the camera and hid it in my robe pocket. I locked my bedroom door and connected the camera to my laptop. The screen filled with grainy footage of the study. At first it showed nothing but the quiet room, the blinds drawn against the afternoon sun. Then Melissa appeared. She closed the door behind her, walked to the desk, and pulled out a folder. I pressed my hand to my mouth as I watched her take out a sheet of paper and slowly write my name. Evelyn Parker, again and again, each time adjusting the tilt, the loop, the line of the P. Her face was calm, focused, her hand steady with practice. She compared the fresh attempts to documents laid beside her. My documents. She whispered my name under her breath as if rehearsing a role. Tears stung my eyes, but they were not tears of grief. They were sharp hot with anger. Proof. At last, undeniable proof. I replayed the clip, watching the steady movement of her pen, the false versions of myself spreading across the page. I thought of Daniel, of how he would defend her if I showed him without context, how he would say I misunderstood. But this was not misunderstanding. This was calculated theft written in ink. I saved the file twice, once on my computer and once on a flash drive I had bought at the shop. I tucked the flash drive into the lining of my purse where she would never think to look. Then I closed the laptop and sat very still, the sound of my heartbeat steady at last. Melissa knocked softly on my door a little later, asking if I wanted tea. Her voice was syrupy, practiced. I told her I was resting. I did not let her in. Behind the door, I whispered to myself that the game had changed. She thought she was building a case against me, but she had just written the first chapter of mine against her. When night fell, I lay in bed not sleeping, the flash drive pressed against the fabric of my purse beside me. I stared at the ceiling and let my anger harden into resolve. For months she had erased me piece by piece, convincing the world I was fading. But tonight, I knew with clarity, I was not fading. I was recording. Drew the curtain and lay down with the flash drive inside the lining of my purse, and the knowledge that I finally had enough to pull the truth into daylight. Dr. Grant's words followed me out of his office like a shield I could carry in my pocket. At home, I moved with a quiet steadiness I had not felt in months. The folder he gave me rested inside my purse, and every time I touched it, I reminded myself I was not losing my mind, no matter how carefully Melissa tried to weave that story around me. I kept the hidden camera running in the study, and I started using my phone to record conversations that sounded too practiced, too neat. It did not take long before another piece of evidence fell into my hands. One evening, while folding towels upstairs, I heard their voices float up from the living room. Melissa's tone was low but sharp. She was telling Daniel that once guardianship was approved, the first step would be selling the house. She said it with certainty, as if the decision had already been made. She called it wasted space, a burden I could not handle. She said the money from the sale would cover assisted living, and the rest would give them a secure future. Daniel hesitated, his voice uncertain, asking if it was necessary. Melissa's response was cold and quick, reminding him of his duty, reminding him that I was slipping and someone had to step in. My stomach turned, but I stayed still on the landing, letting the phone in my pocket capture every word. That night, I transferred the recording to my laptop and copied it onto the flash drive that already held the footage of Melissa practicing my signature. Seeing the files lined up on the screen gave me a strange comfort, like bricks forming a wall I could stand behind. Still, I knew I needed more than recordings in secret. I needed someone with authority to see them. I met Janet the next morning at a small coffee shop near the library. She listened through her headphones as I stirred tea I could not bring myself to drink. When she looked up from the laptop, her expression told me I was not imagining any of it. We were past suspicion, she said. This was evidence. She told me she knew someone who could help Assistant District Attorney Rachel Collins, who specialized in financial exploitation cases. Janet suggested we present the pattern first without names to test the waters. I agreed, and within 2 days we had a quiet appointment arranged. The DA's office was all glass walls and polished floors, a place built to strip away pretense. Rachel Collins listened carefully as I laid out the documents, the camera footage, the recordings. I did not speak with emotion, but with order, as if balancing a ledger. She asked precise questions. Did I still have access to my accounts? Who picked up the mail? How many withdrawals had been made in the last 6 months? I answered what I knew and promised to provide what I could confirm. She told me she would request official bank records and compare signatures. If what I presented held, there would be grounds to act. She urged me to live as normally as possible and warned me that retaliation sometimes came when schemes began to crack. Back in my neighborhood, Melissa's influence was visible. Linda stopped me by the mailbox and told me gently that maybe selling the house would be the best decision, the kindest gift I could give myself. Her voice carried the echo of Melissa's phrasing. Later at the grocery store, Carol said she heard I was considering senior communities, that Melissa had spoken of it as a practical step. My throat burned as I nodded politely, knowing I had never spoken those words. The lies were spreading like roots under the foundation. At home, Melissa's control pressed harder. She moved bills to paperless statements praising herself for simplifying my life. She handed me forms to sign while the television blared, smiling when I said I would look at them later. Twice I caught her watching me with narrowed eyes, as if trying to gauge whether her story of my decline was still working. I kept my own face calm, and my phone kept recording. One Thursday night when they left to run errands, I went into the study to retrieve the camera. A hunch led me to the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet where Melissa liked to leave tidy piles of papers. Beneath a stack of utility statements, I found an envelope with a corner torn. Inside was a set of documents from a real estate office in Hendersonville. The first page was a purchase agreement for a mountain cottage, 2 bedrooms near a lake. The buyer's name was Melissa Parker. The second page was a receipt for a $20,000 deposit. The source of payment was my savings account. For a moment, the room tilted. My knees shook as I sat in Thomas's old chair, staring at the numbers that confirmed what I had feared. The deposit date matched the week of the $15,000 withdrawal and another smaller one I had missed. It was not just petty theft or manipulation. Melissa had begun building a future with my money, my work, my security. I photographed every page front and back, capturing the signatures, the routing numbers, the initials. Each click of the camera felt like another nail in the coffin of her lies. I returned the papers to the envelope exactly as I had found them and closed the drawer aligning the stack so nothing looked disturbed. My hands were steady now, steadier than they had been in weeks. In my room, I saved the photographs to a new folder and copied them onto the flash drive. I labeled them clearly: purchase agreement, deposit receipt, account reference. Then I texted Janet a short message. I found something big. "We will meet tomorrow," she replied with a single word that carried the weight of trust. Understood. When Daniel and Melissa returned later that evening, their voices drifted up the stairs. Daniel asked if I needed anything from the store. Melissa offered me tea, her tone syrupy. I answered that I was already in bed. I sat at my desk with the folder from Dr. Grant beside the flash drive, my hand resting on both. One sentence echoed in my mind: no evidence of dementia. Patient fully competent. At the window, the street was quiet, the bare branches of the maple tree scratching against the winter sky. Somewhere not far from here, Melissa imagined a cottage she would call her own, paid for with money Thomas and I had saved for our old age. I pressed my palm against the cold glass and let the chill anchor me. The house creaked around me, the same sounds I had once mistaken for loneliness. Tonight they felt like witnesses waiting with me for the moment when the truth would no longer hide in shadows. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen blinds, catching the edges of the papers Melissa laid carefully in front of me. She smiled as if she were doing me a favor, sliding the pages closer with her manicured fingers. She said the insurance company needed updated information, just routine paperwork. My eyes moved over the heading and my stomach tightened. It was not an insurance form. It was a new power of attorney granting her full control over everything I had left. I lifted the top page slowly, letting the silence stretch between us. My heart pounded so loudly I feared she could hear it. I set the paper back down and pushed it toward her. I told her I would not be signing anything today. Her smile thinned, her eyes narrowed for just a flicker before she arranged her face back into concern. She said I must be tired, that sometimes too much detail could be confusing. I folded my hands on the table and met her gaze. I said I was not confused. Daniel walked into the kitchen just then, his hair damp from the shower, his tie slightly crooked. Melissa looked at him with the subtle panic of someone whose mask had slipped. She said I was refusing to sign the forms the company needed. Daniel sighed and rubbed his forehead. He looked at me, then at the papers, then back at the floor. He told me not to make this worse, that Melissa just wanted what was best for me. His voice was flat weary, as if he had said the same sentence too many times to believe it anymore. He could not look me in the eyes. I wanted to shake him to remind him of the boy who once defended me against neighborhood bullies, but the man standing in front of me now looked hollowed out, worn down by Melissa's constant whispering. I only said I would not sign. Melissa gathered the papers quickly, her jaw tight, and left the room without another word. The rest of the day felt heavy. I moved through the house, touching the folder from Dr. Grant, the flash drive with the recordings, the photos of the deposit receipt. Each piece was a thread, and together they formed a net strong enough to hold me when the lies finally snapped. I repeated to myself that tomorrow I would not be standing alone. That evening, Janet came by. She knocked gently and stepped inside with her calm presence filling the room like steady light. She sat at the table and listened as I told her about the new power of attorney papers. Her face hardened and she told me I had done exactly the right thing. She reminded me that tomorrow was the day everything would shift. She promised me that no matter what story Melissa tried to spin, the truth was stronger. Her words were not dramatic, but they settled into my chest like a steady hand pressing reassurance into bone. When she left, I sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time, the clock ticking too loudly on the wall. The house felt both like mine and like a stage set that Melissa had tried to control. I thought of Thomas and how he would have shaken his head at all of this, how he would have told me to keep my books straight, to hold the numbers until they told their own story. I whispered his name and promised him I was ready. The night stretched long. I lay in bed with the flash drive tucked inside my purse by the nightstand. I rehearsed in my head the order I would present the evidence if given the chance. The forged signature, the video, the recording about selling the house, the psychiatric evaluation, the purchase receipt. Each piece fit together like parts of a ledger that could not be denied. Morning came sharp and cold. I dressed carefully in the navy suit I had kept from my working years, the one that made me feel like the professional woman I had been before all of this. I fastened the pearl earrings Thomas gave me on our 30th anniversary, the last gift before his illness began. In the mirror, my face looked older, lined with months of strain, but behind my eyes there was a steadiness I had not seen since he died. Melissa was already in the kitchen, radiant in a modest dress, her hair styled perfectly. She greeted me with syrupy warmth, asking if I was ready for the big day. Daniel hovered behind her, his tie straight now, his face pale. He avoided my eyes, answering Melissa's chatter with quiet nods. She reached for his hand and he let her take it. They looked like a united front, smiling with the confidence of people who believed they had already won. We drove to the courthouse in silence. I sat in the back seat, staring out at the winter trees flashing past bare branches, scratching against the gray sky. Melissa filled the car with empty reassurances, telling Daniel that everything would go smoothly, that soon I would be more comfortable, that this was for the best. Daniel murmured agreement, though his shoulders stayed tight. When we pulled into the courthouse parking lot, my throat tightened. The marble columns loomed above us, the steps broad and unforgiving. I clutched my purse close, feeling the hard outline of the folder inside. Each step up those stairs felt like a test, but I kept walking one foot after the other. Inside the lobby, I caught sight of neighbors clustered near the benches. Linda, her lips pursed in polite concern. Carol shifting uncomfortably, but still whispering to another woman I recognized from the club. Their eyes flicked toward me, full of doubt, maybe pity, maybe judgment. I straightened my shoulders and met their gaze without flinching. Melissa tightened her grip on Daniel's hand and leaned close to whisper something that made him nod faintly. Then she smiled wide and confident, as if this were her stage, and the rest of us were extras in her performance. I felt the weight of every glance in the room, every doubt Melissa had planted. But beneath it all was the steady pulse of the folder in my purse, the truth waiting to be heard. The clerk opened the courtroom doors, and we stepped forward into the echo of polished floors and hushed voices. I inhaled once, deep and steady, and walked inside, ready for whatever came next. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, the kind of scent that reminded me of every long day I had ever spent balancing ledgers. I sat at the respondent's table, my purse by my feet, and folded my hands in my lap to still their trembling. Melissa sat across the aisle beside her lawyer, her posture perfect, her face arranged into a mask of calm concern. Daniel sat on her other side, staring down at the table, as if the grain of the wood could give him courage. Judge Caroline Hayes entered, and the room rose. She seated herself and glanced over the docket before nodding for the proceedings to begin. Melissa's attorney, a young man with a practiced voice, rose and addressed the court. He said I was a grieving widow who had lost her way, that I had begun spending recklessly, forgetting obligations, and accusing those closest to me of theft. He spoke as though every detail had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. When he called Linda to the stand, she walked carefully, her coat still draped over her shoulders. She adjusted her glasses and said she had seen me wandering the yard at night in my robe, disoriented. She said I often repeated myself, that I had once left mail in the box for days. Her words felt like stones thrown one by one. Then Carol followed, her voice soft with concern, as she told the judge I had stopped coming to bridge without explanation, that I seemed withdrawn and forgetful. Each statement held a sliver of truth, but bent into a shape that no longer resembled my life. Melissa dabbed at her eyes with a tissue when it was her turn. She told the court she had only wanted to care for me, that it broke her heart to watch me decline. She said I accused her of theft, even of forging my name, when all she had ever done was protect me. Her voice trembled at just the right moments. From the gallery I heard a soft murmur, neighbors whispering to one another. Then Daniel stood. My son's hand shook slightly as he gripped the railing of the witness stand. He said I was not the same as I once was, that I struggled with decisions, that I could not manage my affairs alone. His words cut deeper than Melissa's polished lies. My throat tightened, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing under the weight of it. He would not look at me. The attorney finished with a flourish, painting a picture of a family forced to act for my own good, a son and his wife sacrificing for an ungrateful woman who could not accept her frailty. He sat down with the satisfaction of someone who thought the verdict was already sealed. Judge Hayes turned her gaze to me. She asked if I understood the nature of the proceedings. My voice caught in my chest, but I forced it free. I said yes. She asked if I had anything to say before the court made its decision. I rose slowly, every joint stiff, but every nerve alight with purpose. I reached down and lifted the folder from my purse. My voice grew steadier with each word. I said I had evidence the court needed to see. I opened the folder and laid out photographs of Melissa's forged signatures, the video of her sitting at my desk, practicing my name again and again. I produced the recording of her conversation with Daniel about selling my house, placing me in an assisted living facility, using the proceeds for their future. The courtroom shifted as the whispers grew louder. Finally, I held up the report from Dr. Michael Grant, the psychiatrist Melissa herself had chosen. I read aloud the line that mattered. No evidence of dementia. Patient fully competent. The words rang against the walls like a bell struck hard and true. Judge Hayes's face sharpened. She leaned forward and asked to see everything. I handed the folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. She flipped through the pages, her expression darkening. When she looked up, her voice carried a command that froze the air. Close the doors. No one moves. The bailiff locked the rear entrance as the sound of heavy shoes entered from the side. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Collins walked in with Detective Samuel Reed, their presence filling the room with a weight that was not family, but law. Ada Collins spoke clearly, stating that her office had been investigating the allegations of elder financial abuse and fraud. Detective Reed stepped toward Melissa, his hand resting on the cuffs at his belt. Melissa's lawyer leapt to his feet, shouting that the evidence was circumstantial, that this was a misunderstanding. Judge Hayes cut him off with one raised hand. Melissa's face lost its calm mask, her features twisting from disbelief to rage. She stood quickly, reaching for Daniel, but he pulled his arm back as if her touch burned. Detective Reed's voice was steady as he read the charges aloud. Elder financial abuse. Forgery. Identity theft. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Melissa shook her head violently, shouting that it was all lies, that I was confused, that Daniel knew she was only trying to help. Her words cracked in the air, brittle and desperate. The cuffs closed around her wrists with a metallic snap. The sound silenced the courtroom. Every neighbor who had whispered against me turned their eyes toward me now, their faces shifting from doubt to something else entirely. Some looked ashamed. Some looked astonished. Linda pressed a hand to her mouth. Carol's eyes filled with tears. Daniel sank into his chair, his hands covering his face. His voice broke as he whispered something I could not hear. For the first time in months, I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift. The truth had walked into the room and spoken louder than any lie Melissa had ever told. The room sat in stillness, the kind of silence that comes not from absence, but from shock. Judge Hayes gathered the papers and looked at me directly, her eyes steady. The neighbors' gazes rested on me now with something entirely different from the suspicion that had greeted me when I walked in. For the first time in this long fight, I was not invisible. When the gavel struck the block, it sounded like a door closing on months of darkness. Judge Hayes read the ruling in a voice that carried through every corner of the courtroom. The guardianship petition was dismissed with prejudice. Melissa Parker would face criminal charges, and the evidence of her fraud and exploitation was more than enough for the state to proceed. Detective Reed led her out in handcuffs, her voice rising in shrill protest that no one believed anymore. Daniel sat frozen, his face in his hands. The neighbors who had been summoned as witnesses turned toward me, their gazes no longer filled with pity or doubt, but something softer, closer to shame. I lifted my chin and let the silence settle. Weeks later, the trial that followed brought the final verdict. Melissa was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ordered to repay $68,000 she had stolen from my accounts. I sat in the gallery, my hands folded neatly in my lap, while the judge outlined her punishment. Melissa stared straight ahead, her face drained of the confidence she once carried into my home. When the sentence was read, I did not feel triumph. I felt release. Afterward, Linda found me outside the courthouse. She held her purse tight against her side and would not meet my eyes at first. Then she whispered that she was sorry that she had believed Melissa's lies about me, that she had repeated them to others. Carol came a moment later, her eyes wet, telling me she wished she had asked me directly instead of trusting what she heard. Their apologies did not erase the isolation I had felt, but they mattered. I told them I accepted their words and that we could begin again. Daniel stood apart for a long time. When he finally walked over his steps unsteady, his face was streaked with tears. He said he had betrayed me, that he had listened to Melissa when he should have listened to the mother who raised him. His shoulders shook as he cried the same way they had when he was a boy, frightened of thunderstorms. I wrapped my arms around him and held on. I told him justice had spoken that day, not anger, and that what mattered now was rebuilding what had been broken. Life began to feel mine again. I returned to the bridge club, the women greeting me with fierce hugs and promises never to let distance grow between us again. The laughter around that table filled spaces that had gone silent for too long. With Janet's encouragement, I used what I had endured to create something new. Together, we started a small consulting service for older adults, teaching them how to protect their finances, how to recognize the warning signs of manipulation, how to stand firm when someone tried to make them doubt their own judgment. The work gave me a sense of purpose stronger than anything I had felt since Thomas passed. Each client was another life shielded from what I had suffered. Months later, I stood on a small stage in the community center facing rows of folding chairs filled with neighbors, seniors, and families. I spoke clearly, my voice carrying in a way it never had when Melissa was cutting me down. I told them that if it happened to me, it could happen to anyone. I told them to guard their independence, to trust their instincts, to lean on friends before isolation could take hold. I watched faces in the crowd nod with understanding, and I knew the message had landed. As I stepped down, Daniel met me at the side of the stage. He looked stronger, as if each day apart from Melissa's control gave him more of himself back. He took my hand and said he was proud. I squeezed it, gently grateful that our bond, though battered, had survived. That night I sat by the window of my home, the same house Melissa had tried to claim, and listened to the familiar creaks and sighs of the wood. The maple tree outside swayed in the evening breeze. For the first time, those sounds carried no dread, no sense of being watched or erased. They sounded like home. If you have followed my story to the end, I ask you to share it. Talk about it with your family, your friends, and your neighbors. Elder financial abuse hides in silence, and silence is its strongest weapon. The more we speak, the more we protect one another. Stay with us here where stories become warnings, and where warnings become shields for those who still need them.